Dear viewers, welcome back to Shapes.io. I am Vince, and this is part 11 of the BUTTMAM series. Now, I know last video was quite the ordeal. We had a lot to talk about, and so the video turned out to be almost 50 minutes in the end. The good news is that today will be better, I think. Or I hope. Well, we'll see, I guess. Anyway, if you've been following along from the beginning, there are a few things you'll know about this factory by now. It tries to assemble a set of 4 pieces plus potentially a 5th layer with which the final shape can be constructed. The pieces it tries to find can either be flat pieces or floating half-layer shapes, and it has cycling modules built in that will try different piece combinations over and over until the validator module finds the right one. Now, because of this rotation mechanic, this try and if you fail then try again kind of approach, basically a brute force approach, I started noticing a trend in my machine. Sometimes, actually more often than not, it would spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out the composition of shapes that were actually relatively easy. And the reason for that is something we will have a look at in detail in another video I have planned. But the gist of it is that overall, there's a fixed order of candidate pieces that the machine will consider. And the combinations it lines up first are the shapes with quad floats in them. In other words, if the machine finds a quad float for the shape, it will try those combinations first. And after that, it will work its way downward with tri-floats, then duo floats, and finally no floats. So ironically, this also meant that shapes without floats, in other words, shapes that a regular MAM can also do, they took the longest to get analyzed correctly by this machine. So there was a discrepancy, almost an inverse proportion even, between the complexity of the shape on one hand and the time it took my machine to get it analyzed and created on the other. Shapes that were pretty complex would sometimes be found instantly, while the analysis stage of a non-float or a relatively simple floating shape would take up to a minute or longer. And I wanted to fix that. The way I did was essentially by putting a smaller floating shape analyzer module inside the big one. I labeled this piece of wiring the FastLane module, and that's what I'd like to have a look at today. So this TMAM is actually 2 analyzer modules in one. Shapes are fed into the FastLane module first, and if that can already find a solution, then the entire rotation / candidate lineup / brute force thing doesn't even come into play at all. So it's kind of like, you know when you're at the supermarket, for example, and you're queuing at the checkout, and you have a very large cart of groceries, then when you notice that the customer behind you has only very few items, you let them go first? Well, that's kind of what it's like. If it's a small order, it gets priority handling, and you quickly put it out between other taller orders, something like that. Now, the FastLane module is a relatively simple module. If you look at it, it might look big and complex, but it's a one-shot module. So it doesn't involve any of those complicated rotation mechanics or wiring maneuvers in which you let the output of the machine loop back to its input or anything. No, the shape is fed into the input, it runs through all the processing units, and it can have one of 2 outcomes. Either it finds a solution or it doesn't. Done. Okay? So, let's have a look at a few displays that I prepared. So, the type of shapes that this module can do is either shapes with no floating layers in them or shapes with relatively easy floating layers. And what I mean by easy is that, you know, the floating quadrants can always be compared in pairs of adjacent layers. right? So either there is a float on layers 1 and 2, or there is a float on layers 2 and 3, or there is a float on layers 3 and 4. Or potentially there is a float on both layers 1 and 2 and on layers 2 and 3. But in that case, the shapes can simply be stacked together without anything collapsing. That's basically what it is. And the types of floats can be fourfold. Either you have 3 pieces on the bottom layer and 1 piece on the upper layer, like in this example. That's the first possibility. The second possibility is the reverse. You have 1 piece on the bottom layer, on the lower layer, and 3 pieces on the upper layer, right? That's the second possibility. And the third possibility, and also the fourth possibility, is when you get half-half. So you have 2 quadrants on the lower layer and 2 quadrants on the upper layer. But in that scenario, you can have two outcomes, 2 variants, right? And the first variant, you get a diagonal stack. So the quadrants on the lower layer are located diagonally with comparison to each other, and the ones on the upper layer as well. That is the third scenario. And the fourth scenario is where you get a lateral stack, right? So the quadrants on the lower layer are adjacent, and so are the ones on the upper layer. Okay? Those are the 4 possibilities. If you get that, then the FastLane module can handle it. What the FastLane module cannot handle is a shape like this, for example, where I call it like a winding staircase. You have a duo float right here, and then the other duo float fits orthogonally into that, perpendicularly. So, those types of shapes it cannot do, but the other ones it can. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a shape into the input, and then we're going to have a look at the wiring and look at how it works. Yeah, okay, so let's look at this shape. I provided a circle below and a circle on top, a gray one, to kind of sandwich the floating layers in between. So we have the first scenario, which is 3 quadrants on the bottom layer and 1 on top. Okay, and you can also see that it found this shape immediately. It didn't take long at all to analyze this shape, and the reason for that is obviously because it went through the FastLane module, and you can see that the pieces are immediately aligned correctly. So onto the wiring layer. The shape is fed here. This is the input. And the first thing I'm going to do with this shape is I'm going to try and find out where the floating pieces are, if any. Okay? And I'm going to do that by unstacking the layers and then in pairs restacking and unstacking the layers again. And the thing is that this will tell you can compare the output with the input, and if that's the same, then you're not dealing with a floating layer. That's basically what happens, okay? So I take off layer 4, I take off layer 3, I stack those together to get this result, and I unstack that again. And if you don't have a floating layer, then that will mean that the output of this unstacker and the input you get here, they are going to be the same. So you can compare that, and if you have a 1, then that means no, you don't have a floating layer. That's why I put it through a NOT gate, because for me the 0 means no, we don't have a floating layer. Found it easier that way. On the other side, the same thing happens. So we stack the shape, we unstack the top layer again, and you see that there's a match. And depending on whether we have a match or not, these shapes are, directed onto one wire or the other. We are looking at layers 4 and 3, right? Where we don't have any floating bits. But now let's have a look at layers 2 and 3. And per definition, with these kinds of shapes, you are always going to have complementary quadrants, right? So if you stack them together, you see that layer 3, we have a quadrant in the top left, and layer 2, we have a cutout in the top left. And that is always going to be the case for these kinds of shapes, okay? And that means, per definition, that if you stack them, these two layers are going to collapse to one layer. And that's how you can tell. So in this case, right, I don't have a top layer to take off anymore. And therefore, the results of neither will be the same as the input. Here we have our red shapes, but here we don't have an output. Here we have our yellow quadrant, but here we have the collapsed layer. So in neither of those cases, the result is going to match. And that's how we know that we have a pair of floating quadrant layers, right? For the first layer and the second layer, we don't have any floats, and therefore the signals are cut. And well, this wire is a wire where the bottom layer may just bypasses everything and go all the way to the back of the machine, right? But in this case, these shapes may move along to the analyzer modules. And if we zoom out, then you see a three-way fork in the road. And these modules are identical, actually, right? So this is a module for the layer 1 and 2 combo. The one in the middle is for the layer 2+3 combo. And the one at the bottom is for the layers 3+4 combo, right? So these three modules are identical. So we can have a look at one of them, and that explanation will apply to the other ones as well. So what do we do after that? Well, I am going to find out which case is applicable here, right? We have different possibilities of stacking, of floating quadrant relations, 3+1, 1+3, 2+2 but diagonal, and 2+2 but orthogonal, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find out which of those we are dealing with. And the way I do it is as follows. Come on, frame freeze, there we go. This is my bottom layer, correct? I'm going to take the bottom layer and I'm going to count the amount of quadrants on it, which in this case is 3. The way I count it is by running it through 4 analyzer modules, and they are connected with, 190-degree rotation each. So the amount of signals that I get here will correspond one-on-one with the amount of quadrants on the layer, okay? And with a smart stacking module, I'm going to stack that. And the output of that will be a shape that has the same amount of layers as the bottom layer of our pair has quadrants. Okay? So the amount of quadrants in a first step, the amount of quadrants on the bottom of 2 layers is converted to an amount of layers on a coded shape, right? And that is something we can count. So I run that shape, the output of the stacker. I run it into an unstacker again, and that is going to tell me the amount of layers this shape has. If it has 1 layer, then the signal in the first, at first, the signal will be output here, and it is encoded with a circle shape. Then we're going to see if we also have a second layer, which we do. And if we do, then that signal is going to cut the first one. So it's going to cut the circle signal, and it's going to output a square instead. And well, the third layer is going to do the same, but with the second. If we have a third layer, then we are going to output a star signal, right? Technically, we don't even need this, because a shape like this can never ever, per definition, have 4 layers. And I hope you are still with me as to why. If we got a shape with 4 layers here, well, then we wouldn't be having floating quadrants, right? And the shapes wouldn't be fed into this module in the first place. The reason why I still have this is because I recycled this layer counter from an older machine, and that's why it's still there, but basically the windmill shape is never going to apply. Anyway, what I do is I encode the amount of quadrants into a meaningful shape. If there is 1 quadrant, we're going to get a circle. If there are 2 quadrants, we're going to get a square. If there are 3 quadrants, which is the case right now, we're going to get a star. And that signal is going to feed into 3 comparing units, and that is going to block the road for 2 of the 3 paths, and it's going to allow 1 of the 3 paths to continue. So basically we have a 3-ways fork in the road. 1 for the case where we are dealing with a 3+1 combo. Another 1 for the case where we are dealing with a 2+2 combo. And 1 for the case where we are dealing with a 1+3 combo. Okay? So we take the bottom layer, we take the top layer, and we let them continue. In this case, we are dealing with 3 quadrants on the bottom layer. Okay? And if that is the case, then we can always cut the shape vertically and work with the left half versus the right half. So what I do is, we know that per definition, the top layer only has 1 quadrant on it. Per definition, because if it had more, then these signals wouldn't be fed into this module. So this output is always going to have only 1 quadrant on it. And I'm going to check whether that quadrant is on the left or on the right. So whether it's on the top left or bottom left in one case, or the top right or bottom right in the other. And I'm going to connect that with the lower shape, the shape on the lower layer. Because the advantage of this is that you can always work with the left half and the right half. So what I'm going to do is I look at which half of the shape this upper quadrant is on, and I'm going to pair that with the quadrant on the same side of the bottom layer. And I do that with a cutter and transistors. The cutter, per definition, is only going to output on one of both sides. If the quadrant's located on the left, it will take the upper route, and if it's located on the right, it will take the lower route. And with transistors, this line is connected, or these lines are connected to the corresponding quadrants on the same side of the shape of the lower layer. In this case, the left half. So what we do is this signal allows this signal to pass onto the module. And you can see that if I rotated this 180 degrees, then we would get this signal output right here, and that would block this signal. So it would block this signal, and instead it allows this signal to pass. Okay? So, in order to construct a half a shape with a floating layer, we need scaffolding. So what I do is, I take this line, and I'm going to rotate this piece 180 degrees, and I'm going to stack it on top of itself. That is going to be the scaffolding. I stack it on top of itself, but not only that, I also stack it on the shape of the upper layer, so that we get this. And the result will give us this weird looking shape. Okay? Now the only thing we need to do is split this in half again and throw away the scaffolding and keep the actual piece. How can I do that? Well, I'm going to split it into the left half and the right half again. And per definition, we know that with this method of working, our scaffolding pieces will only be oriented in one corner of the shape, whereas the other one will have 2 quadrants per definition. So what I can do, or the easiest method that I found, is rotate the shape 90 degrees, and if you cut it then the actual piece will always have output on both of its sides, and the scaffolding will never have output on both of its sides. So we can run that into an AND gate, and if the AND gate produces a 1, then that means that we have our actual piece. And the one that produces a 0, well, that's the scaffolding, that gets blocked, okay? And the other one is allowed to pass. So that's how that happens. We get our first floating half shape. And that line may continue onward. We'll have a look at that later. In the meantime, we also have the remainder, right? So what we did now up to here was cut out the half of the shape of the bottom layer that we need to create our floating piece. But obviously we still have the remainder. We also need to output that. So that is what this bottom thing does. And it does the reverse, right? If the shape, if the quadrant of the upper layer is located on the left, well, then the remainder of the bottom layer is going to be the right half, per definition, and vice versa, right? So what I do is I flip this shape. If it's on the left, I flip it twice, so it goes to the right. And if it is on the right, and I flip it twice, well, it's going to be on the left, per definition. And again, I'm going to do the same trick. So now, if the shape is on the right, then that means this may pass as a remainder. And if it were on the left, well, then the left piece would be allowed to pass as a remainder, right? I could do I do this with rotation, but it might work. It would work equally well with NOT gates, for example, right? If I do it like so, and I put 2 NOT gates here, exactly the same result, right? This achieves exactly the same thing. Let's put that back the way it was. Boom, boom. There we go. NOT gates out. And there. And that is how we get both pieces that are allowed to pass, right? Our floating piece and the remainder. Come on. There we go. That's the first scenario. Now, let's have a look at the second scenario. The second scenario I'd like to have a look at is the one where we don't have 3 plus 1, but we have 1 plus 3. So, cut these out. Did I mess up? There we go. So now we have the opposite scenario. Let's see how that works. Again, this first part stays the same. This module analyzes that we have the floating pieces in the middle. So again, it's going to output that again. But this time, we notice that the amount of layers on this layer counter is 1, and therefore we output a circle, whereas before it was a star. You remember? So now, this shape matches this comparing unit, and our both pieces are output on the upper line. Here, we have a very similar thing, except everything is going to be reversed, you know, whereas before we knew that per definition we had 1 quadrant on the top layer and 3 quadrants on the bottom layer. Well, now we know that per definition we have 1 quadrant on the bottom layer and 3 quadrants on the top layer, right? So this module essentially does the same, but the inputs are flipped. So we're going to take the bottom layer, we are going to analyze which half of the top layer we should stack that with. I now take the bottom layer, I rotate it twice and use that for scaffolding. I stack it on top of the remainder of the top layer. And we get another weird looking piece in which I do the exact same, I run the exact same procedure. You know, you get a piece with 2 quadrants per definition, which is the actual quadrant, and the other piece, which is the scaffolding, which also per definition is going to have both of its quadrants, you know, pressed into one corner. And with the AND gate, we can check which one is the actual piece and which one is the scaffolding. Same thing with the remainder. You know, you flip the ideology again, and you let the remainder pass, and you get 2 pieces again that are allowed to continue onwards to the end. That's the second scenario. Now, let's have a look at the third scenario. Where's the hub? There it is. Hello. Hello, hub. So now we have a piece with a diagonal float in the middle. And we're going to have a look at that again. FastLane module. Again, we have them in the middle, and therefore the signal is output here. Again, these machines are completely identical, right? So it really doesn't matter which one we look at. So this time we get a layer counter that outputs a square, which means that we have 2 quadrants on the bottom layer, and the signals get output here. Now, it gets a little more interesting, because if we have a 3+1 combo or a 1+3 combo, then only one of 2 sides will need a floating stack. If we have 2 and 2, then both sides, both left and right, are going to need a floating stack. So that is exactly what we do. Let's see. We're going to need this bit later. Right, but the first thing we do is we just crosswire this. The left of the lower layer gets to go together with the left of the upper layer, and the right with the right. And we get 2 identical scaffolding stacking modules, you know, which outputs 2 of these weird looking shapes. And, you know, the rest is just the same. Cut it in half. Look at the side which has 2 quadrants on it. That is the actual piece. Up here, same thing. 2 quadrants, actual piece. The other one, scaffolding. Gets blocked and thrown away. In this case, since we have 2 of these pieces already, we have no remainder. And that is how both of these pieces are allowed to pass onto the end of the machine. So each of these modules is always going to output 2 lines, right? We saw that before. If you have 1+3 or 3+1, then you're going to have a floating bit plus a remainder. Well, in this case, you're going to have 2 floating bits. Okay, that is that. And then the final piece, the final scenario, that's a bit trickier. So, this is the lateral stacking, okay? So you see that the red pieces are on the right, the bottom layer is on the right, and the upper layer is on the left. This is a bit trickier. And the reason is because up to here, we were always able to work with left halves and right halves. But now, all of a sudden, we are going to need to check that. Because in this case, if we cut a left piece and a right piece, and they are on different layers, well, then that's going to collapse, right? So we have an additional hurdle here. And that is what these modules do. So this little module, it is going to try and find out whether we are dealing with with an orthogonal stack that has its 2 pieces on the left and the right. If it has them on the top and the bottom, then no problem. But if it has them on the left and the right, then that means we are going to need to rotate our shape 90 degrees first. Because only that way, if we cut left and right, we are not going to break our stacks. I hope you understand what I'm saying. If you don't understand what that means, then maybe you should brush up on, you know, how floating layers work exactly and how they can collapse. Okay? But that is basically what this module does. So it's going to check whether if I rotate the shape 0 times and 3 times, output, if we have an output on both of these analyzer modules. And if we do, then that means we're going to need to rotate our shape 90 degrees first. So we have a split, actually. I rotate the shape 3 times here, and if we are dealing with a left-right stack, then I'm going to leave it at that. And if we don't, well, then I'm going to rotate the shape one final time, and we're going to, we're going to have the same as the input again, right? So in this case, this signal is jammed, and this one is allowed to continue. And basically what we do with that is that we're going to rotate our entire shape 90 degrees. Okay? So again, we get these weird looking shapes. We cut them in half. We keep the one that has the 2 pieces. We throw away the one that doesn't. But now this line also runs all the way to the back of the machine, where if this line is a 0, it means that previously we rotated the shape 3 times. And that means we're going to need to rotate it one final time again. And that's what that does. So if we have a 0 here, well, then this rotated shape is allowed to pass, and this unrotated shape isn't. Okay? And the same thing happens for the other piece as well. This one is allowed to pass after it's been rotated once, and if we didn't have that scenario, well, then this signal would be allowed to pass, and that is how we get that. All right? So the non-floating layers, if any, they also get routed. They bypass the entire module, and come on, frame freeze, thank you. They are going to end up like right here at the end of the module. And what I have now is I have a ton of output wires, right? Each of these can be a pair of floating shapes, or one floating shape and a remainder, or, you know, regular layers. All of them, they meet up here. But per definition, I know that only 4 of these lines can have a value. That is always going to be the case. Because since a shape can only have 4 layers, well, it can only have 4 outputs. And even if we have floating pieces, well, then those floating pieces, plus potentially their remainder, they are also going to cover 2 layers. So per definition, we can never ever have more than 4 signals on these lines. And since we know this, I can run these lines into this module, which is basically a line reducer module. So what it's going to do is it's going to take, I believe it's a total of 10 or even 12 lines right here. And it's simply going to let the pieces cascade until they fall down to the bottom 4 lines. And those 4 lines we are going to output, right? And that's exactly what you see happening right here. So this module, it looks super convoluted, but it's just it just takes up a lot of space. It essentially just, it's a cascading module where these pieces fall down. You know, like the Connect 4 kind of game, that's kind of how it works. So these pieces fall down until they stumble on, you know, on a piece that's already there, and then they just, you know, they stay floating atop or something. And then the last thing they're going to do, well, they are going to be fed into a validator module, which is basically an exact replica of the other validator module we already looked at. So it's going to try the 3 stacking methods that we spoke about previously of circle, square, and star stacking method, right? So the full house type 1, full house type 2, and the linear stack. It's going to try all 3 of them. And if we get an output, well, then we get an output. And that output is also going to cut the output of the rest of the entire stacking module, right? So eventually, in the big machine, we get our output through the lane sorter, right? So the shapes or the pieces would be output right here. Okay, but if we get an output from the FastLane module, then that is going to take priority and it's going to cut whatever may be coming from these lines. In this case, in this moment, we have found the same pieces. Or actually, have we? No, we haven't. Exactly, we haven't. Right? You can see that the other module actually didn't find the pieces, but it doesn't matter anymore because the FastLane one already did, and it cut the signal for the other one. Right? So this 0 is connected to the rest of the module as well. So as soon as we get a shape here, which per definition means that we found a correct solution in the FastLane module, well, then the rest is not going to matter anymore. And the pieces that we need, well, they get output right here. And they then, well, they run through this validator one, another time, but it doesn't really matter because this validator is going to output the exact same thing. Okay? And that's how that runs into, the assembly units. We spoke about that before. That is the FastLane module. That is what I wanted to talk about today. And the FastLane module allows me, it's basically a shortcut. If we are dealing with a shape that's relatively simple, then the FastLane module will take care of it. And for example, the FastLane module will be found if we input the the logo shape we all know and love. So let's input that. And you're going to see that immediately we are going to find it because it is output in the FastLane module, right? There it goes. We get our shape right here. Same for the rocket shape. I know some of you may be struggling with the rocket shape, and I don't mean to sound pompous, but at this stage where we are currently at, I do consider the rocket shape to be a pretty easy shape to do. So also here, it immediately finds the correct solution thanks to the FastLane module. Okay, so that's that. I hope you found it interesting to watch, and yeah, I have nothing more to add to that. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you're looking forward to part 12, and I wish you all a lovely day. I am out. Take care. Bye bye.